So what we're talking about today, just to frame it out a little bit, is rent administration, the tenant collection portion. So if you're here to think about the subsidy portion, I'm afraid that's another panel for another day, but hopefully we'll keep you interested with the tenant portion. There's quite a lot to say about it. The thing that I hope you take away from this most of all is that when you think about rent collection, when a number of providers think about rent collection, something about rent collection seems to spark this either-or dichotomy. If we need to collect the rent, or we need to have the tenants feel safe and secure and have their social service needs met. And what I hope we're able to deliver today is that it's actually not an either-or. They're not mutually exclusive goals. They're actually goals that operate in tandem, which is to say, by collecting rent effectively, we are able to secure a tenant's well-being. By having a tenant feel safe, secure, and in the right home environment, we're able to ensure the likelihood of rent collection being more consistent. This really lends itself to the notion of collaboration. So in supportive housing, rent administration is usually carried forward by the property manager, but social service support is really critical for that function. Whenever we think about collaboration, we think about a Venn diagram, right? So I had to put one together here. So you've probably heard the term shared goals, different roles, and that's a term that I'm bringing forth today. The idea of rent administration as something that naturally lends itself to coordination is pretty apparent. The way people sometimes think about it is that there's sort of like a healthy sparring, like a good cop, bad cop, and that can happen too. But finally, what you really see is that the property manager has this notion of maintaining financial viability for the program. The service provider is trying to help clients achieve well-being, self-sufficiency, but all of this comes down to clients staying stably housed and maintaining a respectful community for all tenants. So why coordinate? Even when you're working with a tenant in chronic arrears, the idea that you can get that person to a place where they feel more stable, where you're able to get the rent more consistently, should be the goal. This comes down to the concept of harm reduction. Are people familiar with the concept of harm reduction? Should I? Okay, cool. So harm reduction is a notion, you meet the tenant where they are. The tenant might have challenges, but you're not trying to solve all the challenges right away. Some you might not be able to solve at all. But you're getting the tenant to a place where they're able to manage their challenges in the context of self-sufficiency. So harm reduction is key in rent administration. Evictions generally should be rare and should occur only in truly unresolvable circumstances. The legal process for non-payment is really expensive. Anybody who's worked in rent administration knows that once you start a legal process, you have to be prepared to pay a lot out. So you're doing some math with regard to how does the money that I'm going to be collecting coming back to me and then some if I take them through this legal process. And then those who are familiar with housing court know that housing court can be pretty pro-tenant. There's a philosophy in housing court that the tenant should stay housed, that the goal of a non-payment process shouldn't necessarily be eviction. So even if you're working with someone who's incredibly challenging, going in there with a collaborative concept for what's going to happen next is going to be helpful to your case. This is not the process that everybody uses, but generally speaking, and the rest of the panel will talk about their variations on theme, you have the rent invoice, you have the late letter, you have the rent demand notice, you have the notice of petition. These are generally served by the property manager, but all of these are opportunities for the social service provider to get involved. So think of them as points of engagement, and we'll be talking more about that as we go. Consistency is a huge theme when it comes to supportive housing and when it comes to rent administration and supportive housing. So consistency of timing. If you have a practice for when you send out your notices, send them out at the same time every time. When tenants start to get the impression that things are kind of loosey-goosey, then they use that as an entry point for potentially taking advantage. Consistency of treatment, the policies that you have and keeping them consistent. Even if you have a policy that says in this circumstance we may give a tenant some leeway, or in this circumstance we may be more stringent, being able to execute on that consistently for each tenant. And then making your rules clear. So not just going over them at intake when it's natural to go over them, but making sure that there's something that everybody on your team knows and that they're communicated to tenants in a consistent way. There are different ways that providers collaborate. Meetings are definitely one example, but meetings should be the point of collaboration that is the most formal And then there should be conversations that continue to take place as you go so that there's various moments in which your property managers and your social service providers are chatting about what's going on with your tenant and rent arrears. There should be some type of document that everybody gets a chance to look at and think about that demonstrates where your rental arrears situation is. And then your ongoing dialogue and everybody knowing who it is on the opposite team, so to speak, that they're chatting with. To that point about the ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, if you're thinking about helping clients, and we're not going to be able to go into this too much today, unfortunately, but if you're thinking about helping clients avoid arrears, then anything you can do in terms of tenant services is going to be really helpful, and that could be financial literacy, money management, job placement, life skills seminars, the things that keep tenants from going into arrears before your arrears situation ever gets a chance to take aggressively hold.